Welcome to Early Bisbee with Richard W. Graeme IV and myself, Annie Graeme Larkin. Thank you to our members and donors who enable the museum to provide free online programming and fulfill the organization's mission to discover history, explore Bisbee's past today. To learn how you can assist the museum in supporting its mission and programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit bisbeemuseum.org. On Saturday, April 18th at 11 a.m., the museum will host the free online program Historic U.S. Highway 80, the Broadway of America with Mike Anderson. To register or for more information, visit the events section of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum's website or Facebook page. All right. Richard W. Graeme IV has worked in mines in Alaska, Colorado, California, and New Mexico. He also worked in Bisbee at the Queen Mine Tours as a guide, where his knowledge base was put to full use. Because of the difficult times in the domestic mining industry, Rich switched from a mining major to education. He earned his degree in education from the University of Arizona in 1999. And he has been teaching for 26 years in the southeastern Arizona area. During this time, Richard has authored and co-authored several books and articles, including The Mineralogy of Bisbee, Arizona, Volumes 1 and 2, Seven Bells, Mine Accidents at Bisbee, Arizona, and Forgotten Caves of Bisbee, Arizona. And while I'm the regular host of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum's online programs, you may not know much about me. I'm from a Bisbee pioneer family and have been steeped in the community's history my entire life. It was my fascination with the community's past that drew me to preserving the region's history. I earned my bachelor's degree in history from the University of Arizona and a master's degree in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. I am the author of the postcard book Bisbee and the co-author of Early Bisbee, a work which I wrote with my brothers, Richard W. Graeme IV, my co-presenter today, and Douglas L. Graeme. And currently, I serve as the executive director of the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum. And if you would like to ask us questions during the program today, please type your questions into the Q&A chat box, and we'll be gathering those to answer after the presentation. Also, links to the program recording and to purchase a copy of the book Early Bisbee will be sent to all of our Zoom registrants later today. And with that, I'd like to welcome my co-presenter, Richard Graeme.
Hey, Annie.
Hi. Let me get this up. There we go.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the more interesting aspects or possibly some of the aspects that are less understood or talked about in Early Bisbee. So some of the more common things, like maybe the George Warren story, we're not going to really touch much on. Okay, you want to go for it, Annie?
All right. Thank you, Richard. In this 1876 map, you'll see the southeastern corner of southern Arizona is listed as the Chiricahua Apache Reservation. And right down here where this S is in the word mountains is about where the community of Bisbee would emerge. And then you'll notice that there isn't much definition to this section of the map. Well, why is that? Why did the surveyor not spend a great deal of time covering the area? Well, this section of Arizona is an area where the uninvited guest simply did not linger. It was known to be a haven for outlaws, and then was, of course, the homeland of members of the Chiricahua Apache tribe. And the Chiricahua had a challenging relationship, you can say, with the United States government. And it was this challenging relationship that brought an Army scouting party into what would become known as the Mule Mountains. This party was led by Lieutenant Anthony Rucker, and among them was John Dunn, an Army scout. Now, it was when John Donne was tasked with finding a suitable water source for the party that he decided to go a different way back to the encampment. And that puts Bisbee's story into motion.
And we can look at right here, and this is what he discovered right here, or he noticed, was known as the Iron Monster. It was a large outcropping, or more of a series. There were two or three of them hooked together of various iron oxides, hematite, goethite. So it would have been a red, brown, black in color. And unlike with many mining camps, like a lot of gold camps, you find a gold nugget, and that's pretty obvious what it is. The ore that he discovered was cerussite, and in this case, it would have been very subtle. Okay. There, oh, I'm too fast. And you can see a sample of cerussite from Bisbee. And even though cerussite is white to sort of a silvery gray, typically in Bisbee, it often is coated with minium, which is sort of a red-brown color. So the rocks he was finding would have looked just like ordinary rocks, particularly around an iron oxide outcropping. The difference is when he picked them up, they would have been extremely heavy because cerussite is a lead ore, it's lead carbonate. And so it would have weighed 2 to 3 times heavier than an ordinary rock. And the importance of cerussite is not being a lead ore. Lead ore in Bisbee at this time would have been basically worthless. But what excited him is that lead ores almost always contain silver, and then often they contain a large amount of silver. So this is what really excited him. And we'll talk about the Copper Queen mine, which was really the first real mine to develop in Bisbee, and it began in 1880. And it was a outcropping, or they had to expose it. They exposed an area of malachite, which was a significant copper ore, and it was running pretty high grade. It was running about, greater than 20%. And we'll see a couple of pictures of the malachite right here. Now, we also need to understand that this malachite was ore grade malachite. Don't think of the Russian malachite or the malachite that's coming out of Africa, or even the malachite that was later found in Bisbee. This would have been, and it's hard to see from these pictures, these malachite samples, which came from just a few feet underground in the Copper Queen itself, actually have a yellowish tinge because of the iron oxide it contains. You get a little bit of a color shift with the camera. And it's very porous. It's not cuttable, but it's great ore. It's wonderful ore. And there's actually I would say, pushing 80, 90 kilogram sample at the Freeport McMoran offices that came from this find. Not the prettiest malachite that they have on display, but historically the most important. So we have to understand that the malachite at this time was not stuff that the miners were taking home and showing off to their families or necessarily sending to museums. It was great ore. It was wonderful ore. Not necessarily very pretty, though. Now, the Copper Queen mine was actually a very primitive mine, and the owners of the mine did not want to spend a lot of money developing it. And they did later put in an incline shaft, which would parallel this ore body as it descended. This ore body would to go 200 feet below the surface here. And the incline did as well. It paralleled it before the ore ran out. But the mining was very primitive, very traditional, hand drilling, pushing cars by hand. A little incline shaft still has one of the cars still in it, and it could hoist about somewhere between 500, around 500 pounds of rock, about a quarter ton of rock in each load. So by mining standards, it's very primitive. very simple mining technique. And they weren't willing to invest anymore because they weren't finding any other ore bodies other than the one that they were mining, even though it was incredibly rich. They just weren't finding any extensions of it at the time. And if we look at it here on this map, and I know it's going to be hard to see, this section right here is the Copper Queen claim. And it shows all the ore that was ever mined out of the Copper Queen. So in these black areas. So actually the Copper Queen claim produced very little ore. When you compare it to the black areas right here, which show the stopes that were mined in the other areas, the Southwest mine, the Zara mine, the Holbrook mine. This shows about 1/3 of the mining district. So it was just a tiny, tiny amount of ore. But we're going to focus on the Atlanta claim, which is right up above the Copper Queen claim, because that's what really set the district into motion. And it's also causing some historical problems right now, at least for me, because as the story goes, and I'm going to give a very abbreviated version, James Douglas was sent to Bisbee to examine the value of the Atlanta claim. And he got here, he liked it, so he began developing some prospect adits, which are short tunnels. He also developed at least 2 shafts on the Atlanta claim, exploring for ore. And it was the second one that finally hit ore. And the story goes that with the last, I think, $50,000 given to him by what would later become Phelps Dodge, he sank down a shaft down, and at 210 feet, he hit ore, and then the success of the Atlanta claim was assured. The problem with this story is that if the hard physical evidence indicates the Atlanta shaft was in a very unusual location. Okay, so the Atlanta claim would have gone from up in here across the front of the hill, roughly. It would be about 300 feet wide and about 1,500 feet long in a straight line. As a kid, I was always told the Atlanta was over here. But looking at mine maps, the Atlanta shaft is indicated being up here. And that does pose a little bit of problem historically. And I've actually been to the Atlanta shaft up here. There is a shaft there, a double compartment shaft. It's filled in now. They filled it in the 1980s. And I've been to it underground as well. And it matches the description nicely. In a mining sense, it doesn't make any sense that it's up there. And the other thing that causes problems is that the Atlanta shaft up there did hit ore, but whether it would have been considered ore at the time is a little bit questionable. There's a small ore body about 100 feet below the collar of the shaft, and I would hazard a guess, and I know this is dangerous to do, that it was running somewhere in that 7 to 12% copper range, which is very good, but it would not have really excited them that much in 1884 when all this was occurring. But it is shown there as this labeled like that on the company mine maps, and it does exist. In a mining sense, it would make a lot more sense for it to be down here, closer to where the Zara shaft is. But that is something that has to be determined with more research. What that does for Bisbee history is it would change it that instead of the Copper Queen and the Atlanta or Phelps Dodge merging friendly into the Copper Queen Consolidated Mining Company, what it would have been at that point is that it would have been a law of the apex potential lawsuit, because James Douglas and Phelps Dodge would have said, well, we own the top of the ore body because we found ore up here, and now we're claiming that we own your ore as well. It would change it that way. And that sort of doesn't fit well with the history, because James Douglas is well known for stating that in Bisbee they were intending, and this is after this occurred, much after, that they were going to ignore the law of the apex and property lines were going to serve as property lines, and you would not try to mine or off of somebody else's claims. I guess I better explain the law of the apex really quickly, really roughly. The law of the apex says, in real crude terms, that whoever owns the top of the ore body owns it all, whether it goes under somebody else's land or not. And in Bisbee, it's sort of famous because they chose to ignore that. After the initial few years, they decided who's going to profit here, mining companies or lawyers. And so they accepted property lines as property lines, whether your ore crossed onto it or not. So that would change that up a little bit, but it still needs a lot more research. Annie uncovered some of the original claim maps. Unfortunately, they don't show any mine workings on them. The maps that were developed for patenting the Atlanta claim. But more research needs to be done that. Personally, I'd prefer it down here. But the hard evidence indicates up in a canyon. But as we were talking about, the mining at this time is nothing really fancy going on here. It was basic hand drilling, and pushing the mine cars by hand. And this would continue for most of the early years. Hand drilling, you'll often see it mentioned as hand drilling takes a lot of skill. Well, the skill in the hand drilling is not hitting the drill steel with a hammer, with the sledgehammer. Okay, the skill is planning the blast pattern that came with it, because when you're drilling the holes by hand, you aren't going to try to drill 20 holes and blast the pattern like you would today. You're going to selectively place those holes, looking and reading the rock to determine the weaknesses and the flaws in it, so you can drill and blast as few holes as possible to accomplish your task. And that is the real skill. Okay, it's not the drilling part. It's actually placing the holes and understanding the rock. And a lot of people get confused on that. Okay, it did take some skill to hit the drill steel without breaking your hand or breaking somebody else's hand. I admit that. But the true skill was choosing where to put the holes. Then mining, continued. But then in 1906, I would argue the most pivotal event happened. The Holbrook #1 shaft, and the Holbrook #1 shaft is right here. Okay, caved in. And they lost the upper 200 feet of the shaft. They were able to save the bottom 200 feet of the shaft. But this was the main hoisting shaft. So they were using it to take all of the ore out of the mine, and much of the ore out of the czar and some of it out of the nearby spray mine, all the way to the surface and deliver it to the smelter. So it didn't do a whole lot of good, but they were able to save the bottom 200 feet, 300 feet of the shaft actually, and lose the the top 200 feet. So they were forced, and they did this very quickly. They started from the bottom and they drove a shaft upwards. And this is the Holbrook #2 shaft. And they did it in 75 days before it became operational. It was sort of quasi-operational, not because the shaft wasn't ready. It's just there was a timber shortage in early 1907, like January, February 1907. So they weren't able to actually do the mining that they wanted to because they couldn't get the timber to support the ground. The driving of the shaft was a temporary fix, but what it did, it made the mining company rethink. They had done some early planning about modernizing the mine, but this sort of forced the issue. All of a sudden, they're going to have to invest a lot of money into the mine, and this time they want to do it correctly. And so they wanted to make it a very modern mine. So after the loss of the Holbrook shaft, there's a very short period of time where Bisbee becomes one of the most modern mines in the world. Okay. Um, and we will start to see it. Okay. Now, initially, right after the shaft caved in, it wasn't long before they brought mule haulage in. And remember, mules, and remember, this is going to depend on what the ore is. If you're hauling lead ore, those mules are going to be pulling fewer cars than you are with, let's say, oxide copper, which is going to be a lot lighter, or sulfide like chalcopyrite and boronite is going to be a lot heavier in those cars. So somewhere not exceeding 5 cars, half-ton cars were being loaded, and so that increased production. Then they made what is probably another major change. Well, it is a major change, but it did cause some problems. Is that they brought in pneumatic drills. The problem with pneumatic drills is all of a sudden it was easy to put a hole anywhere you wanted, a blast hole. And you started developing these blast holes that went from, 12 to 30 holes or even more in some cases. And it took away the skill. You weren't necessarily reading the rock anymore. You were just drilling a hole wherever you wanted it, filled it full of explosives and blasted. But you weren't, and again, you were not blasting small blasts of 2 or 3 holes anymore. You were doing the entire blast pattern, which, as I said, can be 12, 30 holes, depending on the area. So all of a sudden, mining is becoming very quick and very rapid, and you're losing some of the skill as far as reading the rock, and that would have some negative consequences. It also did have some with the rock drill dust for a very short period of time. And this one shows that this drill is a Widowmaker. There was no water hose in this machine to wet down the dust, which of course causes lung problems in the long term. But in the short term, it was going to cause some really serious problems as well. So to develop it into a modern mine, they decided they were going to introduce trains underground with trolley locomotives. And then they were going to, now, after they got rid of the little tiny mine cars of the Queen Incline, and like at the Holbrook mine, they were hoisting 2 cars at a time on a single cage, double deck cages, and these were half-ton cars. So when they got rid of the Copper Queen Incline and they went to the Czar and then later the Holbrook, they were very rapidly, they were moving 4 times as much of rock in the same amount of time, basically. But still, hoisting cars takes a lot of time. You got to push the car on, you got to chain it down, okay, because you got to secure that car in the cage. Then you got to hoist them up. Then you got to reverse the process, and then you got to put the empty cars back on. You got to secure them so they do not move on the cage and drop them. And they wanted to convert to skips. And the skip like this is a drawing of them. I couldn't find any decent photos of an old skip in operation. And they were moving between 4.5 and 5 tons. And it would take about 1 minute to get from the 1600 level, 1600 feet below the surface, to the surface and dump. And so it was very rapid. The other big change that they had to do is to develop these haulage tunnels. And this is the 3rd level Southwest mine, which as you will know as the Queen Mine Tour, is in this green right here. Or there's more than that's on the tour, but you can see it's a nice straight tunnel. Okay, it is actually away from the mining areas. The mining area is right here. And then there's another mining area right here. And then there's some small ones over in here. But the big one was right here. And another large one was right here. But you can see that it avoided it, made a nice loop for the trains to go through and come back. This little section right here had to be added later on because this area right here is really bad ground. I mean, that is seriously heavy ground. But they didn't know that when they designed it. And then this tunnel here went off to the Uncle Sam and Cuprite mines and actually went all the way over to the Shattuck mine. So they made these smooth easy to run trains through, and they avoided the mining areas. And the reason you avoid the mining areas is because these areas are temporary. As soon as you're done mining them, you're going to let them collapse. And even if you've backfilled them, they're going to collapse to some point, and that will destroy the mine workings around it. And so you want to keep these in an area where it's just relatively low maintenance. And that's what they were able to successfully do by uh, making those haulage crosscuts away from the main mining areas. They also developed Mitchell slicing, which is one of the most important mining techniques developed in Bisbee. And this was not developed by the Copper Queen. This was developed by the Calumet in Arizona. And basically, what you would do is you would mine two ore bodies or two sections of an ore body. You'd mine it in panels or blocks. You'd mine one section, then you would mine the second section. And then to mine the pillar that you left between the two, you would Mitchell slice. And it's a little different where these were mined from the bottom going up. This one is mined from the top down. And it's heavily timbered and very popular technique. You also, when you were drilling and blasting, I don't know if you can see the little drill there. There's very little handling of the rock. When you blasted it, you designed it so it would try to flow into the chutes on their own. You did have to muck out sometimes. And then, and I forgot to mention this at the beginning, our presentation is going to go to the year 1917. Because after 1917, Bisbee changes dramatically. And you can see the beginnings of the Sacramento pit, some of the early cut work in the Sacramento pit, some of the testing is still going on up in there. And then by 1918, the Sacramento pit is a full bore mine. Safety became a big issue at this time, and it started in 1912. And it's part of it is as a result of that not being able to read and understand the rock, this fast-paced mining. All of a sudden, their accidents started to go through the roof. At one point, they were losing a man every 2 weeks. And this would be in the entire district. This is not just the Copper Queen. This would include the Calumet in Arizona, and the Shattuck, and the Wolverine, and all of the small mining companies. But still, that is an extremely high number. And the safety was not developed from the mine itself. It was borrowed from the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad, which was having its own issues with safety. And so they decided to buckle down on safety. And then very quickly, because the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad and the Copper Queen are closely related companies, the Copper Queen borrowed it, and they really made a major push on safety. By 1913, they had a safety program, and it took a couple years, but it was very effective. It was effective, I think, because of the approach they took. They made it safety was not just a work, it was part of your life. And they wanted the wives involved, they wanted children involved. They would go into the schools and give lectures on safety, which made total sense because, once you got into an 8th grade classroom or early high school, some of those guys were ready to start working underground. Not necessarily as miners, but as guys like tool nippers. By 16, there were a lot of 16-year-old tool nippers. And then as they got older and they physically got stronger, then they could be looking at some of the mining positions or the more physically strenuous.
Right. And as word of the successful mining operations in Bisbee spread across the country, it also spread across the world. And the mining companies wanted to attract a stable workforce. They did not want the stereotypical tramp miner who would come to the community, earn a paycheck, possibly drink away that paycheck at a local saloon, and then they were off the next week off to another mine. They wanted stable people. And who are stable people? Men with families. And so they provided the types of services that families would come to expect. So these services would include essential services like a fire department, which is shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. They also established a bank, and then more of a amenity type of services, including a library. And here is the second Copper Queen Library building, one of the predecessors to our fabulous library building today. And for those of you with a familiarity of Bisbee architecture, you might notice this building looks an awful lot like the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museums building, which was originally the Copper Queen Consolidated offices. Of course, another essential component, especially to live in the desert, is having access to water. And the Bisbee Waterworks was established in the mid 1880s. And what happened there was two canvas sacks were strapped across the back of a burro. These sacks were then filled with water. They could hold about 20 gallons, and then burros would deliver them to the residents and businesses within the community. Now, burros were ideal for this chore because they're able to navigate the rocky and steep terrain that Bisbee has. And knowing that a rural Western mining community would have unreliable transportation for goods, the Copper Queen Consolidated Mining Company established the Copper Queen Store. And in this image, you see the store, which is the larger building here, as well as the warehouse next door there. And the store offered a wide variety of products, including fabric. They had stoves for sale. And to make sure they had something everyone would want, they even offered dynamite among their products. An interesting side note, you will see at the top of the building here, they have a commemorative stone denoting the year the building and business were established. And that stone is actually on display at the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum in our Urban Outpost exhibit. And entrepreneurs understanding the flow of money that was going through Bisbee came with luxury goods. And so we would now have stores that offered very fine products, including cut glass, mineral specimens, silver sets, all kinds of things that you would desire, maybe not be able to afford, but desire to have in your home. And in this top image, you can see, let me get my mouse working again here. There we go. You can see this beautiful cut glass punch bowl here. Directly behind it is a mineral specimen. And then off over to the left is another mineral specimen. Then you have rows and rows of pocket watches here. And in the lower image, you will see that the showcase is filled with jewelry. Behind the gentleman are silver sets. Across from them, there's more china. There is china, rather, as well as more crystal. My favorite aspect about that photo in particular is they also offered a spittoon for their guests there. Perhaps one of the most important amenities that the mining companies initiated for the community was the Warren Bisbee streetcar. Now, the Calumet and Arizona Mining Company understood that the Warren Mining District's inhabitants would want to easily get themselves from one part of the district to another. At this point in time, we had approximately 20,000 people living in the Warren Mining District. Now, when I say that, that means not only Bisbee proper, but we're talking about other communities such as Johnson Addition, Lowell, Don Louis, and Warren. And so if one desired to live in Warren, let's say, but they worked in Old Bisbee, they needed a reliable form of transportation. And the streetcar offered just that. As you could see, this was a little bit of a party within our community. I'm not sure if we've seen such a big party since. It was such a celebration that the children were given the day off of school. It is reported that bands played patriotic music. And my favorite aspect about the whole celebration is that as the streetcar approached Bisbee, as it passed the mines let off dynamite salutes. And I know we have some buildings shown on the left side of this image that you all may not recognize. You may not be able to readily place where this image is. So in the center here, this is the Bisbee Mining and Historical Museum today. Again, it was the mining company offices. And so here would be the entrance to Brewery Gulch right in there.
Okay, and we'll look at the red light district. And the first recorded lady of the ill-famed district was Irish Mag. And I say recorded because very little information is available on the red light district, particularly in the early years. And then the information that we do get, you have to understand, is going to be very one-sided. Okay, you're not going to see much in the way of positivity here. It's going to be in police records, notifications of arrest or fights on Brewery Gulch in the red light district. So it's going to be a very biased viewpoint, but that's what pretty much that we have. And like with this description of Irish Mag, it came from a young boy. It came from Joseph Chisholm, who later wrote the book Brewery Gulch. But he was a young kid at the time when he wrote it, and he described her as a small, dark-haired woman. This is all he remembered of Irish Mag. She seemed to be sensitive and caring. And then she noticed that, as it says there, she lived in the West End next to Billy Daniels with a green parrot in an oak tree in a cage. But little else is known. But it didn't take long because Bisbee very rapidly was becoming a booming community. And let's see here. Oh, there we go. A little bit slower. Okay, and you can see Bisbee did have a red light district, and you can see it right up here, outlined in red. It's way up at the end of Brewery Gulch. Basically, roughly from the bottom of Youngblood Hill up into Zacatecas Canyon. It did have to get reduced in size because there were problems with this building right here. It's hard to actually recognize that this is Central School, and the red light district had to be 1,200 feet away from that school. And so they actually reduced the size of the red light district just a little bit to keep it out of the school district. And then in 1892, the red light district was formed. Before 1892, your ill-famed ladies could just work in the main community. They could walk into bars and restaurants, which was less than ideal for the community. They weren't really thrilled with them doing that. So they did develop a red light district inside city limits. And the reason they wanted it inside city limits is they wanted to maintain at least some control of the district, put some restrictions on it, which I'm not sure was totally effective. And sometimes the restrictions sort of backfired. So maybe the better question is, rather than who were they, but why were they? Okay, and we have to understand, I think what really caused the red light districts to sort of boom was that at this time, of course, women were expected to single women were expected to live with their parents or a close relative or with their husband if they were married. And the parents or the husband were expected to support them. There was no way a young woman could work a normal job, a regular job like house cleaning or doing laundry or a cook, and make a livable wage. So for the time period that we're talking about, a woman could earn $1 a day versus if you worked on the surface in the mines or underground, it would be anywhere from $3.50 to $5 a day, depending on your position. And that was an adequate wage. It was actually a very good wage. So if a woman ended up in a difficult situation, let's say her parents died, with giving her no means of support and she wasn't married, she was in deep trouble. If she was in an abusive marriage, the red light district was one of her few escapes, if many cases her only escape out of it to survive. So in many cases, it was sort of a forced situation. And then there is a couple cases where the parents actually forced their daughters into the position to work in the red light district to pay for their parents, which was less than ideal, but it did happen. The other thing that we need to understand is that the original district as it formed was very different from the district after 1910. Originally the district had dance halls and sold alcohol. And actually the girls got a lot of their income from dancing and selling overpriced drinks. Okay. After 1910, they outlawed dance halls and selling alcohol in the district. So in the sense at that point, their business was solely based on sex. Okay. And it actually the district seems to get a little darker. They seem to have a little bit more problems after that period. They didn't have problems before that. Even though the ladies of the red light were readily available, the men did prefer their chaste sisters. This girl right here is from a red light district, but she's from Douglas. I don't know of any good picture of a determined red light girl from Bisbee, but this one will have to do. It's from Douglas, and this is one of the a lady from Bisbee, similar time period. And probably other than Irish Mag, the most famous is Anita Romero. She had a house up at the end of Prairie Gulch for just a couple years. It became what is referred to as a rough house. There was quite a bit of fights going on. So after 1901, a couple of people were killed up at her house. So in gunfights. So she moved back to Mexico, and the last evidence I could find of her was in Cananea, living in Cananea. And she was one of them that was a proud mother. She had a son that she was very proud of. And by the time she was met up with in Cananea, he was doing very well. But she's one of the more well-known of the earlier ones. But not all of them, ran these little wild houses. Although I must admit, I think Anita's may have not been by choice. It just ended up being that way. Ma and Pa Riley actually had red light houses at Fort Huachuca and at Gleason at different times. And Ma Riley, I don't know her real name, and I don't know Pa Riley's real name. Actually, Ma Riley had been adopted by a family who ran ill-famed houses. And as she grew up, she just felt that was the place that she belonged, just running ill-famed houses. And they had a reputation of actually caring about their girls and feeling that the girls had just gotten lost on the path of life, and they tried to look out for them. And Ma was supposedly very true and loyal to her husband and not one of the ladies herself. Now, let me go back a slide. Now, sorry about that. They did sell their house, their ill-famed house, for $500. The lady who bought it was Cora Miles. Cora Miles was about as far away from a good practical Christian as can be. She ran a very wild, violent drug environment, filled house. She was just a little bit different. Yeah. And so that brings us into drugs. And we're going to talk about opium. Opium was available in Bisbee. The source was believed to have been Naco Sonora, um, but it didn't have the prevalence that some of the other areas had. And part of it is there was a very small Asian influence in Bisbee uh, compared to a lot of other communities, largely for legal reasons. They weren't allowed to be in the community. The other thing is patent medicines could be initially obtained pretty easily, and they could give quick results. Cocaine was available in the early days in Bisbee because they record some snow parties that occurred, but also opium is not that easy process because what you have to do is you take the opium and you put it on a needle and you have to heat it over a lamp and you make a little marble out of it. Then you pop the marble and you put it into the mouth of the pipe. And then opium is not smoked, it's vaporized. So as you can see with this girl here, it's hard to see, but the bowl of the pipe is actually over the top of the lamp. So it's upside down. And so she's heating the opium and she's vaporizing it. In this process, may need to be repeated up to 100 times for a heavy duty opium smoker. So it was a sort of a complex process. But they did have a number of arrests and they had issues with it because for a long time, you could own the pipes and the lamps and the entire kit, and that was totally legal. So even when they arrested you for having it, the police would have to return it to you because they were not allowed to seize that. Then we had two saloon districts in Bisbee. Saloon district number one was Main Street, and it went all the way up to Castle Rock, and that's where it ended. And then you had the second saloon district, which is more well-known, was Bury Gulch, and it went all the way originally through the red light district to city limits. But we have to understand that there's a lot of competition with the saloons, and so they had to offer special things going on. It's really common that they would offer food 24 hours a day. And you have to understand, miners were getting off, early in the morning, and they were tired. They didn't want to have to go home and cook dinner, and many of them, if not most of them, were single, so they could just stop in the saloon and get their food and buy drinks to go with it. But also, they had to have other things going on. And of course, we had saloons like the Orient, which specialized in gambling. You had the Annex Saloon, which specialized in gambling on mining competitions like hand drilling. That was its specialty. A lot of the guys who were really big into hand drilling competitions and mucking contests and things of that nature, and car pushing contests. So the mucking and car pushing contests are different than what we would see today. Were popular at the Annex. The brewery had a bear for a time, and the bear would drink beer and then would go up and smack somebody with the soft part of its paw, and the miner would punch him back, and they'd get into disagreements. And then finally, the bear got aggressively took a bag of candy away from a small girl, and that was, well, it was the downfall of the bear because the owner, Joseph Muheim, put a chain on him, and the bear accidentally hung himself from that chain. And then the bank exchange offered taxidermy. It had the taxidermy exhibits, all kinds of different wildlife, roadrunners and Gila monsters and various types of snakes. It was considered quite a large collection of different taxidermy animals. And then my favorite were saloons like the Azurite Saloon and the Office Saloon had cases of minerals from the local mines and ores, and they're very popular. And Geo Roberts also, but he also acquired the office saloon, so the part of that came from the office saloon. So, and miners would trade for drinks at this time as well. Because mineral specimens, if you're not familiar with Bisbee minerals, they're quite extraordinary.
Like many other communities, Bisbee has faced its share of disasters. Early residents of the mining camp would utilize materials that were readily available to them to construct their buildings. So in this case, it would be, of course, wood as well as adobe bricks. They would also place these structures in close proximity to the mines where they worked. So homes would be located as they are today along the hillsides, and businesses and homes as well were placed in the floors of the canyons. Unfortunately, though, Mother Nature would teach Bisbee's residents about these choices. The first noted fire in Bisbee took place in 1885. It is said that a bartender looked out his window and saw a pile of trash ablaze. He went outside and with his pistol fired a rapid succession of shots to warn the community about what was happening. The fire quickly spread, and at one point, an explosion took place, and flames are said to have shot up 80 feet into the air. This fire was so devastating to the community, it actually wiped out the entire business district. Another noted fire in our history was the Chihuahua Hill Fire of 1907. This fire began at the intersection of OK Street and Brewery Avenue and then spread up to Chihuahua Hill. Now, the homes on Chihuahua Hill were constructed primarily of wood and were close together, which resulted in the fire spreading rather quickly. Efforts were made to extinguish the fire using bucket brigades as well as a fire break using dynamite. To create a fire break. And after 3 hours, this strategy did work. Unfortunately, though, it was very sad because over 100 people became homeless as a result of this fire. And undoubtedly, the most devastating fire in our community's history is the fire of 1908. In the evening hours of October of 1908, a fire began at the Grand Hotel and quickly spread through the building. It spread so quickly, in fact, that a man jumped from the third floor of the building to escape the blaze. The fire then went west up Main Street and north up Clawson Hill. And it took some convincing, unfortunately, to have the city leaders use dynamite once again to create a fire break to help stop the spread of the fire. Ultimately, they relented, but the aftermath was great. This is what Bisbee residents woke up to the next day. Upper Main Street on both the north and south sides was totally gone. Portions of Lower Main Street on both the north and south sides were also severely damaged. However, the worst of the destruction, in my opinion at least, was on Clawson Hill. The residential district suffered major damage and only 3 homes survived, leaving 500 families homeless. And anybody who has been here during our monsoon season knows that the weather in Bisbee can change quickly. The first noted flood in our history took place in 1890. Reports say that a violent cloudburst entered the community with terrifying lightning and thunder. Water quickly entered the canyons, and pretty soon, those cracks of thunder were accompanied by the cracks of adobe houses leaving their foundations. And as you can see from this photo of the aftermath, debris was absolutely everywhere within the downtown area. Unfortunately, this image shows the folks not only cleaning the debris, but they were searching for the remains of two missing men who unfortunately died during this flood. And 1908 was most definitely a challenging year, not only because of the fire in October, but because of the flooding that took place in August as well. Three major floods took place in August, the worst of which taking place on August 24th. On this day, again, another monsoon cloudburst entered the community, and it tested the relatively new ditch system, also known as the subway, that the community had recently put in. However, the water from this flood entered so quickly and in such great volume that it literally lifted the street and carried it off. So now you have this massive wave of water, not only carrying the standard debris of twigs and miscellaneous garbage. You have a wave of water going down Subway and Main Street that now has bricks and timber among the other debris. This is another image on the top there of that day, and you can see there that the building, its first floor, is almost completely submerged. Thankfully, and by the grace of some luck, nobody was killed during this flood. However, there were the lives of horses lost, and this lower image shows where the horses had been tied up during the flood. And reports in the Bisbee Daily Review stated that a train had just entered the community when the flooding began. And sadly, the passengers aboard the train watched helplessly as the horses were swept away. And for those of you who may be wondering just about where this is, you can see the Copper Queen Hotel right in the rear of the image here, the top right. And so this would be where Grassy Park is. And over in this area would be where the dispensary, the hospital/dispensary would be, and currently the law office building. And another incredible flood took place in 1910. 3 hours of continuous rain just flowed off the hillsides and into the canyons. Initially, much like the last flood, you would have miscellaneous garbage, twigs, things of that nature being carried away in the floodwaters. However, pretty soon it was household goods, then portions of houses, then entire houses were being carried away in the floodwaters. The destruction was worse. The worst part of the destruction took place between Bisbee and Lowell. And both of these photo postcards show some of the buildings that suffered damage. This top postcard, the house literally slid right off of the hill that it was resting upon. And the lower image shows the force of the floodwaters ripped a portion of the home just right off. Sadly, there were 2 deaths that occurred during this flood, and both of those deaths were a result of people being trapped inside of buildings that were washed away. And one thing I want to point out, especially after reviewing all of the disasters that Bisbee endured in its formative years, is that Bisbeeites were resilient people. They dusted themselves off and rebuilt, got right back to work. They didn't let some of these incredible tragedies get in their way. They carried on. All right. And with that, we'll go ahead and start our Q&A. I will stop our share here. Oh, I do, Richard, before I do you want to tell them about your website real quick?
Well, it's actually more, well, it's jointly with my brother. It's just a Bisbee mining and mineral website. Mineral mining and minerals.com. Has galleries of minerals, some genealogical information on miners. There's a bunch of downloadable books on there. Just all kinds of different things going on there.
All right. Okay. And Richard, one of the questions that we had that I received via email this morning was regarding Iron Springs. If you happen to know the location of Iron Springs.
Okay, the Iron Springs I assume we were talking about the ones that were during the original founding, with John Dunn and Lieutenant Rucker. Okay, those are believed to have been at the base of Sacramento Hill. And that geologically makes some sense because they talk about those waters, those springs being bitter and iron rich. Well, that would be because the springs the water would have been draining through the porphyry there, which was still oxidizing. Geologically, it's not as old, as the exposure is not as old as it could be. And so it would contain a significant amount of dissolved iron sulfates, copper sulfates. It would have been pretty wicked water.
And Sharon is asking, she notes that her home is located on Czar Avenue in Upper Galena. She owns her home, but does the mining company own her land under it? She's heard different things and she's curious.
You own the surface rights. You own the first, I think 40 feet is what it used to be at it. That may have changed. Yeah, but they do own it underneath. And that would be the Briggs mine largely down on there. But most of the ore there is very deep, typically well below the 700 feet below the houses. Most of it, like on the 1200, 1400 levels. So the ore is very deep. So you don't have to worry about mine workings caving up into your backyard or anything. And I don't think you would ever consider remining that. Not in the next 100 or so years. Not in an open pit fashion. You might try to do it some underground, but still be an awful lot of work.
So in other words, she can go about 40 feet down, but she can't sink a shaft.
Yeah, but I'm not sure you'd want to. I mean,
another question from Richard. He says, can you determine where on today's map the Iron Giant was? And so I think he might be referring to the Iron Monster.
yeah, it was right in front of the Queen Mine Tour. It's in that, how it's in that mess of roads right there where Highway 80 was put in, where you can get in and out of the community and the bridge you go under in that area right there. It was blasted out in the 50s, late 50s.
And another question was regarding Lowell. I know you and I have talked about the saloon life and the ladies of Lowell, but did they have an active um, red light district in the Lowell area as well?
They did not have a district, but it was active, definitely. They had ladies in Lowell, and then they called it the beer garden, and that had ladies working there sometimes. And then there was a house there. I don't think they ever recorded the name, but a young miner married the madam of the house. And then there was definitely a rough house there. Lillian and Cornelia Shea had the Shea house. Originally, the Shays had one on Brewery Gulch. But as the mines began to develop, the Lowell and the Oliver and those mines down there, Lowell itself and Junction, Lowell itself started booming. So they moved a house down there. And that would be a very, Lillian and Cornelia Shea were probably rather unpleasant people. They chose a very violent life, both on themselves and other people. Yeah. Um, yeah. Today, what they wrote about Cornelia Shea, which they called him Con Shea, yeah, you'd be sued for libel. What they put in the paper about him, they did. The community did not like that man at all.
Yikes.
So yeah, there was an active, not a district, but there were active houses.
And then what about in Warren? Did Warren have a red light community?
No, because it's against their contract. They uh when they purchased the houses there, they could not. So there never was. Now they had some episodes. They had a woman and I cannot remember her name because she got arrested for this. Ran through Warren without any clothes on, and but that's about the high point. Yeah. There were some pretty strict restrictions on owning a house in Warren. You couldn't have pigs. You couldn't have a bar. You couldn't have a red light type environment, ill-famed house. Uh,
And I think my deed also says I'm not able to slaughter animals on site or something like that too.
that's a bummer.
Um, and lastly, how did Bisbee stack up to other mining camps during that era? So I guess what is being asked is how was production, et cetera, compared to, let's say, camps in Colorado or Montana, et cetera?
Well, you need to compare copper mine to copper mine as far as production. So Butte definitely was substantially bigger. Okay, and so were the mines in the Lake Superior area, the big mines in Michigan. But in Arizona, it held its own. It was a massive producer. And now, once the big open pit mines came in, Lavender Pit is a tiny open pit mine by modern standards. So with 8 billion pounds of copper, today you would consider it on the small side for a copper mine. I'm not even sure you would mine it today by mining standards, unless you could make a really strong profit with it. I mean, with the long environmental, yeah, you have to make a lot of money to pay for that today. But what definitely made it was you made a huge amount of lead and zinc, manganese, and the gold and silver was really substantial. For a long time, Bisbee was the largest producer of gold in Arizona. I think it's been surpassed now. And the silver, which was produced solely as a byproduct, and it did not pay for mining in its own. Um, it 77 million ounces. That's an impressive figure. That makes this one of the largest silver mines in the United States. But again, it was a byproduct. And I guess now that I think about it, 8 billion pounds, it would be on the small side for a mine because a lot of the ore that they mined in Bisbee today, I'm not sure they would mine today. Okay, these small bodies of oxide that are scattered, if you were to remine it, I think a lot of it would be left behind. They're interested in the big sulfide ore bodies or larger ore bodies of oxide. Yeah, handling oxides is not as easy as it used to be because there aren't very many big smelters.
Well, Rich, I know I've kept you well past the time that I promised to have let you go. And thank you so much for joining me today
Okay.
and presenting on early Bisbee.
Okay. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us. We hope to see you again at our next online program, and that will take place on Saturday, April 18th. Until then, goodbye, everyone.